The wind off the Atlantic was cold, the kind of cold that bit through fabric and settled deep in the marrow of the bone. For most people, standing on the edge of the Blackwood Bridge at 2 in the morning would be a terrifying experience. The drop was nearly 80 feet down into a churning black river that eventually fed into the ocean. It was a long way to fall. The woman stood with her back to the railing, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a faded olive jacket. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot. She didn't look like a threat to the 4 men surrounding her. She looked like a mistake, a loose end that needed to be snipped. "You really should have stayed in the car," the man in the center said. His name was Vance, and he was the kind of person who enjoyed the sound of his own voice far too much. He took a long drag from a cigarette, the orange glow illuminating a face that had seen too many fights and not enough sunlight. "We told you it was a simple handoff. You just had to sit there and listen to your music. But you had to look in the trunk." The woman didn't respond immediately. She watched the way the other 3 men moved. They were sloppy. One was leaning against the rusted railing, looking bored. Another was checking his watch every 30 seconds. The third was the only one who seemed nervous, his hand hovering near the waistband of his jeans. They weren't professionals, they were just bullies with a paycheck. "I didn't just look," she finally said. Her voice was steady, unnervingly steady. There was no tremor, no plea for mercy. "I saw what you did to that courier. You didn't have to do that." Vance laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Professional hazard, sweetheart. And now, unfortunately, you've become a professional hazard for us. You see the problem? We can't just let you walk home. And we can't exactly leave a shell casing on a public bridge. Too much noise. Too much evidence." He flicked the cigarette butt over the edge. They watched the tiny spark tumble down until the darkness swallowed it whole. "So," Vance continued, stepping closer, "we're going to make this look like a tragic accident. Despondent woman, late-night bridge, a sudden jump. The current will take you miles downstream before anyone even thinks to look." The nervous man shifted his weight. "Vance, maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Leo," Vance snapped. He looked back at the woman. "Any last words, or do you want to make this hard?" The woman took a breath, smelling the salt and the diesel fumes from their idling SUV. "I'm going to give you one chance," she said softly. "Walk back to your car. Drive away. Forget you ever saw me. If you do that, you might actually get to see tomorrow morning." The men froze for a second, then erupted into laughter. The guy leaning on the railing nearly doubled over. "Did she just threaten us? She's 5'0" and cornered, and she's giving us orders." "I'm not giving orders," she corrected him, her eyes tracking the movement of the clouds above. "I'm offering a courtesy. You're about to start something you aren't equipped to finish." Vance stopped laughing. His face hardened. He didn't like the way she was looking at him. Not with fear, but with a cold, analytical detachment. It was the look a mechanic gives an engine that's about to fail. It was insulting. "Get her over the edge," Vance ordered. The 2 largest men stepped forward. They grabbed her by the arms, expecting a struggle. They expected her to scream, to claw at their eyes, to beg for her life. That's what people did. But she remained limp, almost heavy, making it easier for them to lift her. As they hoisted her up toward the rusted metal railing, she didn't fight them. She didn't even tense up. Instead, she did something strange. She closed her eyes and began to count under her breath. 1, 2. "She's gone crazy," Leo muttered, stepping back. They lifted her onto the top rail. The wind whipped her jacket around her. Below, the water was a hungry, churning mess of white foam and black depths. One push was all it would take. 3, she whispered. Vance stepped up and placed a hand on her shoulder. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale tobacco. "Enjoy the swim." With a forceful shove, he pushed her back. The men leaned over the railing, watching. There was no scream. There wasn't even the sound of her clothes snapping in the wind. Just a clean, silent arc into the darkness. A few seconds later, a faint thud splash echoed up from the depths, barely audible over the roar of the wind. Vance let out a long breath and wiped his hands on his trousers. Clean. "Let's go. We've got a meeting in an hour, and I want to change my shirt." The men turned and started walking back toward the black SUV. Leo was still looking over his shoulder, his face pale. "You okay, Leo?" the big one asked, clapping him on the back. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "It's just—" "She didn't scream," Leo said, his voice shaking. "Nobody falls that far without screaming. It's not natural." "She was in shock," Vance said, climbing into the driver's seat. "People freeze up when they know it's over. It's biology. Now get in the car. We're done here." They piled into the vehicle, the doors slamming shut with a heavy metallic sound. Inside, the heater was blasting shut with a heavy metallic sound. Inside, the heater was blasting, and the radio was playing a low, rhythmic blues song. They felt safe. They felt like they had won. They were already talking about what they were going to spend their bonus on, laughing about how easy the whole night had been. But they didn't see what was happening below the bridge. In the dark, icy water, the woman hadn't hit the surface like a falling stone. She had entered the water like a needle, toes pointed, body rigid, arms tucked. She had used the momentum of the fall to dive deep, avoiding the impact trauma that would have broken the ribs of a normal person. Under the surface, in the pitch black, she wasn't panicking. Her lungs weren't screaming for air. She had spent years training for over-the-side insertions. She had been dropped into the middle of the ocean from helicopters in the dead of night. To her, this wasn't a death sentence. It was a deployment. She kicked hard, her boots pushing against the heavy current. She wasn't swimming away. She was swimming toward the massive concrete pylon that supported the bridge. Above, the SUV's engine turned over, but it didn't roar to life. It sputtered and died. Vance cursed, turning the key again. The engine groaned, a slow, dying sound. "What's wrong with it?" the man in the passenger seat asked. "I don't know. It was fine 5 minutes ago," Vance growled. He didn't know that while they were busy arguing at the railing, a small, black-clad figure had been very busy near their front bumper. He didn't know that the witness they just threw off a bridge was a woman who had graduated from a program so secretive it didn't officially exist, a program that taught its members that gravity was just another tool in the shed. As Vance tried the ignition one more time, the car's headlights flickered and went out, plunging the bridge into total darkness. "Leo," Vance said, his voice dropping an octave. "Get the flashlight." Outside, the wind died down for a brief moment. And in that silence, they heard it. A wet, heavy footstep on the pavement. Then another. The men froze. They looked at each other, the bravado evaporating in the cold air. They were 80 feet above the water. There were no stairs. There were no ropes. There was no way anyone could have climbed back up in 90 seconds. But as the moon broke through the clouds, it cast a long, thin shadow across the hood of the car. Standing there, drenched and shivering, was the woman. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't running. She was simply standing there, reaching into her wet jacket to pull out a small, professional-grade tactical knife. She looked at them through the windshield, and for the first time in his life, Vance realized he wasn't the predator. He was the bait. Vance gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His brain was struggling to process the image in front of him. The woman stood in the center of the bridge, her clothes clinging to her skin, water pooling around her boots. She looked like she had just stepped out of a shower, not a freezing river 80 feet below. "That's impossible," Leo whispered from the back seat. His voice was thin, bordering on a sob. "I saw her hit. I heard the splash. No one survives that. No one." "Get out of the car," Vance hissed, trying to reclaim some of his shattered authority. "She's one person. She's wet, she's cold, and she's probably half dead. It's just physics, Leo. She got lucky." But Vance didn't feel lucky. He felt a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He reached for his door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He pulled harder. The electronic locks were clicking rapidly, back and forth, as if the car's computer was having a seizure. Outside, the woman didn't move. She didn't charge the car or scream threats. She simply watched them. To her, the 80-foot drop hadn't been an end. It was a tactical reset. The moment she had been pushed, her training had taken over. In the world of elite maritime operations, there is a concept called water entry survival. While the men had been laughing, she had been calculating. She knew the height, she knew the wind speed, and she knew the depth of the channel. She had tucked her chin, squeezed her muscles tight to protect her internal organs, and entered the water at a slight angle to break the surface tension. The water had been like hitting a wall of ice, but she had been through drown-proofing drills that made this look like a swimming lesson. She had used the current to carry her to the bridge's massive concrete supports. These pylons weren't smooth. They were covered in rungs, maintenance ladders, and rusted iron bolts left over from construction. She had climbed those rungs with the mechanical efficiency of a machine, her heart rate never rising above 80 beats per minute. Now, she was back on the bridge, and she had the home field advantage. "The doors are jammed!" Leo yelled, kicking at the window. "Vance, do something!" Vance pulled a heavy metal flashlight from the glove box. "Break the glass, now!" Before Leo could swing, the woman moved. She didn't run. She blurred. She reached the front of the SUV and jammed something into the grill. Suddenly, the car's horn began to blare a constant, deafening shriek that echoed off the bridge towers. It was a psychological tactic. In a high-stress situation, loud, repetitive noise makes it impossible for the brain to think clearly. It creates panic. Inside the car, the four men were losing their minds. The noise was vibrating through their skulls. They couldn't hear each other. They couldn't coordinate. The big man in the passenger seat finally managed to force his door open by sheer brute strength. He stepped out, swinging a heavy fist. He was twice the woman's size, a mountain of muscle who had spent years intimidating people in back alleys. He swung a wide, clumsy hook. The woman didn't even step back. She simply leaned to the left, letting the punch whistle past her ear. In one fluid motion, she used the man's own momentum against him. She grabbed his wrist and his elbow, pivoting her hips. The man didn't even have time to grunt before he was flying through the air. He hit the pavement with a sickening thud, the wind knocked out of him so completely that his eyes rolled back in his head. She hadn't used a weapon. She had used his weight. Vance scrambled out of the driver's side, holding the heavy flashlight like a club. "You think you're tough? You think you can mess with us?" The woman looked at him. The horn was still screaming, but she seemed to exist in a pocket of perfect silence. "You forgot the first rule of the water," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "What rule?" Vance snarled, lunging at her. "Never assume your enemy is drowning just because they're underwater," she replied. As Vance swung the flashlight, she dropped low, swept his front leg, and popped back up behind him. It was a move called a reversal, something she had practiced thousands of times in darkened gyms and on the decks of rocking ships. Before Vance could turn around, she had his arm pinned behind his back in a way that made his shoulder sockets scream in protest. "Who are you?" Vance gasped, his face pressed against the cold hood of the SUV. "I'm the person you should have left on the bridge," she whispered. Meanwhile, Leo and the fourth man had finally tumbled out of the back seat. Seeing their leader pinned, they didn't rush in to help. They saw the look in the woman's eyes, a look of absolute calm focus. It wasn't the look of a victim. It was the look of a professional finishing a job. Leo turned and ran. He didn't even look back. He just bolted toward the far end of the bridge, his footsteps disappearing into the fog. The fourth man stood frozen, his hands raised. He had seen enough. The woman released Vance, pushing him toward the fourth man. "Take your friend and go. If I see this car again, or if I hear your voices, I won't use the bridge rungs next time. I'll make sure you're the ones who learn how deep the river really is." Vance scrambled to his feet, his shoulder hanging at a weird angle. He didn't say a word. He didn't try to be the tough guy anymore. He and the fourth man grabbed the unconscious giant from the pavement, dragging him toward the SUV. The engine, which had seemed dead moments ago, suddenly roared to life as the woman reached under the wheel well and pulled out a small wire she had used to ground the ignition. She had disabled their vehicle in seconds with a simple trick she'd learned in a desert camp halfway across the world. They piled into the car, tires screeching as they sped away into the night, leaving a trail of smoke and the fading sound of a broken horn. The woman stood alone on the bridge. The adrenaline was starting to fade, and the cold was finally setting in. She shivered, but her hands were steady. She walked over to the railing where they had thrown her off. She looked down at the black water. It was still churning, still indifferent. Most people would have seen a grave down there. She just saw an old friend. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, waterproof phone that hadn't been damaged by the dip. She dialed a number that wasn't in any directory. "It's me," she said when the line picked up. The handoff was a setup. They tried the accident route. "Yeah, the bridge. No, I'm fine. But I'm going to need a dry change of clothes and a ride. And tell the team. The training held up. Ropes are definitely overrated." She hung up and started walking toward the end of the bridge. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Behind her, the bridge was empty, the only evidence of the struggle being a few wet footprints that the wind was already starting to dry. She had been pushed over the edge, but they had forgotten one thing. When you're a SEAL, the edge is just where the fun starts. The walk to the end of the bridge took longer than she expected. Every time her wet boots hit the pavement, they made a heavy, rhythmic sound that echoed in the quiet night. Her body was starting to protest the sudden burst of energy and the shock of the cold water. Most people would be in a hospital at this point, shaking under a thermal blanket. But she just kept moving. She had a specific type of mental focus that she called compartmentalizing. She pushed the cold into one box, the pain into another, and kept the center of her mind clear for the task at hand. At the edge of the bridge, a low-profile black sedan pulled over to the curb. There were no flashing lights, no sirens. The driver didn't get out. The woman opened the passenger door and slid inside. The blast of the heater felt like a physical embrace. The driver was an older man with graying hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew her better than that. He just handed her a thick wool blanket and a thermos of hot coffee. "They used the Blackwood Bridge," she said, her voice a bit raspy from the salt water. "Vance and his crew. They thought they were being clever. No forensics in a river." The man shifted the car into gear. "And Vance? Is he at the bottom?" "No. she replied, taking a long sip of the coffee. It was black and bitter, exactly how she liked it. I let them run. Panic is a better tool than a corpse right now. They're going to go straight back to whoever gave the order. They'll be scared, they'll be talking, and they'll be looking over their shoulders. I want them to lead us to the source. The man nodded slowly. The source is further up than we thought. It wasn't just a botched handoff. Someone inside the logistics firm leaked your arrival. They knew your background, but they didn't believe the file. They thought retired meant soft. She looked out the window as the city lights began to blur past. I'm not retired, I'm just off the clock. There's a difference. They drove to a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a safe house, though it looked like any other boring rental. Inside, she stripped off the wet layers and changed into dry tactical gear black cargo pants, a compression shirt, and a light jacket. She checked her equipment with a practiced hand. She didn't use many gadgets. She preferred things that didn't have batteries to fail. A sturdy knife, a pressurized glass breaker, and a pair of thin, high-friction gloves. By 4 a.m., she was back out the door. The man in the sedan was gone, replaced by a small, beat-up motorcycle parked in the alley. She hopped on, kicked the engine to life, and headed toward the industrial district. Vance and his crew worked out of a warehouse that supposedly handled surplus electronics. In reality, it was a hub for moving stolen goods and laundered cash. She parked the bike 2 blocks away and approached on foot, staying in the deep shadows of the buildings. Her training as an operator had taught her that the best way to enter a building wasn't through the front door, it was through the place people ignored. She found a ventilation shaft on the side of the building. It was narrow, greasy, and smelled of old oil. To a normal person, it would be a nightmare. To her, it was a highway. She climbed with silent precision, her breath steady. Inside the vents, the sound of the warehouse echoed. She could hear voices below. I'm telling you, she's a ghost. That was Leo. His voice was high-pitched, vibrating with terror. I saw her eyes, Vance. She didn't even look angry. She looked like she was counting us. Shut up about the eyes. Vance's voice was a growl, but the usual edge of competence was gone. She's just a woman who knows how to fight. We got sloppy. We'll fix it. Fix it? How? Another voice asked. This one was deeper, more refined. You were supposed to dispose of a witness. Instead, you had a highly trained specialist walk right back into the light. Do you have any idea who you were dealing with? The woman in the vent froze. She recognized that voice. It wasn't a street thug. It was the man who had hired her for the original security job. The man who was supposed to be her client. His name was Arthur, a high-level executive who played at being a pillar of the community. We pushed her off the bridge, Arthur, Vance yelled. 80 feet! Nobody survives that. A Navy SEAL survives that, Arthur said, his voice cold and flat. They spend their lives in the water. You didn't kill her. You just gave her a reason to come after us. And since you were followed, I imagine she's already close. The warehouse went dead silent. The woman in the vent didn't wait for them to start looking. She kicked the grate open. It didn't clatter. She caught it with her foot and lowered it quietly to the catwalk. She dropped down onto a metal platform 20 feet above the warehouse floor. Below her, Vance, Leo, and 2 other men were standing around a mahogany desk where Arthur sat, looking perfectly composed in a 3-piece suit. You're right, Arthur, she said, her voice echoing from the rafters. I am close. The men scrambled, reaching for weapons, but she was already moving. She didn't use the stairs. She grabbed a heavy shipping rope hanging from a crane. Ironic, she thought, and swung across the open space. She kicked the first man in the chest before her feet even hit the ground. She landed in a crouch, the momentum carrying her forward. Leo tried to run, but she tricked him with a lightning-fast leg sweep. He went down hard, sliding across the concrete floor. Vance pulled a heavy iron pipe from a rack, swinging it with a desperate yell. She stepped inside the arc of the swing, her palm striking his chin with enough force to snap his head back. The pipe clattered to the floor. She followed up with a strike to his solar plexus, and Vance crumpled, gasping for air that wouldn't come. In less than 30 seconds, the room was hers. She stood in front of Arthur's desk, her breathing barely elevated. Arthur didn't move. He didn't reach for a gun. He just sighed and crossed his arms. "I suppose the bridge was a bit much," he said. "But you have to understand, you were becoming very expensive to keep quiet." "I was never for sale, Arthur," she said, stepping closer. "That was your first mistake. Your second mistake was thinking the water would keep your secrets." Arthur looked at his men groaning on the floor. "So what now? You going to call the police? My lawyers will have me out before breakfast. You have no proof of anything." The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the one she had been carrying when they threw her off the bridge. It was military grade and completely waterproof. "I don't need the police to believe me," she said, clicking the play button. The warehouse filled with the sound of Arthur's voice. "Dispose of a witness." He let a highly trained specialist walk right back into the light. Arthur's face went gray. The professional mask finally shattered. "I've been recording since the moment I got in the car tonight," she said. "The bridge, the fall, your confession just now, it's all on here, and it's already been uploaded to a secure server." She leaned over the desk, her eyes locking onto his. "You thought you threw me over the edge, but all you did was give me a better view of the bottom, and it's a long way down, Arthur, much further than 80 feet. Arthur stared at the small digital recorder on the desk as if it were a live grenade. The silence in the warehouse was heavy, broken only by the low moan of Vance trying to crawl away on the concrete floor. The executive's hands began to shake, just a little. He had spent his whole life using money and words to build walls around himself, but those walls had just turned into a cage. "You think this changes anything?" Arthur asked, his voice losing its polished edge. "One recording? In this city, I own the people who listen to those recordings. I'm not sending it to the city," the woman replied. She stood perfectly still, her weight distributed evenly. She was listening. Beyond the walls of the warehouse, she heard the faint, distant crunch of gravel. More than one car. "I sent it to the people you've been stealing from. The ones who don't care about lawyers." Arthur's eyes went wide. That was the one thing he feared more than the law, the people who actually owned the cargo he had been skimming from. Suddenly, the large bay doors at the far end of the warehouse began to groan. A heavy chain rattle echoed through the space. Outside, bright headlights cut through the gaps in the metal siding. Arthur's backup hadn't just arrived. They were coming in hot. "That's my security team," Arthur said, a desperate grin returning to his face. "They aren't like these street thugs, Vance. They're former military. They won't be so easy to trip." The woman didn't look worried. She looked around the warehouse, her mind clicking through a list of assets. A forklift to the left, a stack of heavy wooden pallets to the right, high-tension cables hanging from the ceiling. "You should have taken the deal on the bridge, Arthur," she said. She didn't run for the exit. That's what they would expect. Instead, she headed deeper into the maze of shipping containers. As the bay doors slammed open, 3 men in tactical vests stepped inside, carrying high-powered flashlights and heavy batons. They didn't shout. They moved with a disciplined spread, scanning the room. "She's in the back," Arthur yelled, pointing toward the shadows. "Take her down. I don't care how you do it. Just get that recorder." The woman climbed. She didn't use the ladders. She used the corners of the shipping containers, wedging her boots and gloves into the small gaps. In seconds, she was 15 feet up, perched on a narrow ledge. She watched the beams of the flashlight sweep the floor below her. The first guard approached her position. He was careful, checking his corners, but he forgot to check the ceiling. As he passed underneath, the woman dropped. She didn't land on him. She landed behind him, silent as a shadow. She tapped him on the right shoulder. When he spun around to his right, she struck from the left. A precise hit to the side of the neck, not enough to cause permanent damage, but enough to shut down his nervous system for a few minutes. He slumped into her arms, and she lowered him quietly to the floor so his gear wouldn't clank. Two left. She heard them communicating with hand signals. They were good, but they were used to fighting people who fought back. They weren't used to fighting someone who vanished. She found a heavy wrench on a workbench and tossed it toward the far corner of the warehouse. The metal hit a pile of pipes with a loud clang. Both guards snapped their heads toward the noise. One of them moved toward the sound while the other stayed back to cover him. This was the divide and conquer phase. She moved through the shadows of the overhead rafters, moving hand over hand along a support beam. She reached the guard who was covering his partner. She didn't drop down this time. Instead, she unhooked a heavy industrial cargo net from its winch. With a quick release of the locking pin, hundreds of pounds of thick rope and mesh tumbled down. The guard didn't even have time to look up before he was buried under the heavy netting. He struggled, but the more he moved, the more the weighted edges tangled around his limbs. He was effectively pinned to the floor like a fish in a bowl. The last guard turned, hearing his partner's muffled struggle. He raised his light, but the woman was already in front of him. He lunged forward, trying to use his superior reach. He was fast, but he was rigid. He moved in straight lines. The woman moved in circles. She stepped inside his guard, her hands moving in a blur. She used a technique called deflection, where she didn't block his strikes but simply guided them past her body. The guard grew frustrated. He swung a heavy overhead strike with his baton. The woman caught his wrist, dropped her center of gravity, and used a shoulder throw. The man flipped over her back and crashed into a stack of empty plastic crates. The crates exploded outward, creating a massive mess, but cushioning his fall just enough to keep him from breaking anything. She stood over him for a second, then looked back toward the desk. Arthur was trying to sneak toward the side exit. He was clutching a briefcase, his expensive shoes clicking loudly on the concrete. He reached the door and fumbled with the deadbolt. "It's locked from the outside, Arthur," she called out. Her voice was calm, almost bored. "I took the liberty of jamming the mechanism when I came through the vents." Arthur turned around, his back hit the door. He looked at his 3 elite guards, one unconscious, one trapped in a net, and one buried in plastic crates. He looked at Vance, who was still groaning near the desk. "What are you?" Arthur whispered. "I'm the person who doesn't need a rope," she said. She walked toward him, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the headlights, still shining through the front doors. More cars were arriving. But these didn't have the steady, purposeful glow of security teams. These had the flashing blue and red of the local police, followed by the dark, unmarked SUVs of a federal task force. "You called them?" Arthur asked, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Fine. Let them come. I can deal with the police." "I didn't call the police," she said, checking her watch. "My friend in the black sedan did. But he didn't just call the police. He called the Internal Affairs Department and the federal auditors. They've been looking for a reason to open your books for 3 years. I just gave them the key." The sound of sirens now filled the warehouse district. The game was over. The woman looked at the side door, then up at the high windows near the roof. Most people would see a wall. She saw a series of handholds. "You're staying, right?" Arthur pleaded, suddenly terrified of being left alone with the evidence. "You have to testify. You're the witness." The woman began to climb the wall, her fingers finding the narrow ledges of the brickwork with ease. She reached the high window and pulled herself up onto the sill. "I'm not a witness, Arthur," she said, looking down at him one last time. "I'm a ghost, and ghosts don't like being in the spotlight." She pushed the window open and disappeared into the night just as the front doors were kicked in by a sea of blue uniforms. The cool morning air felt different than the biting wind on the bridge. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, turning the sky a soft shade of pink and gold. A few miles away from the chaos of the warehouse, the woman stood on a quiet pier, watching the tide come in. She had changed into a dry sweatshirt and jeans she'd kept in a hidden locker at the marina. To anyone passing by, she looked like an early riser enjoying the view. They would never guess that 6 hours ago, she had been plummeting toward a black river with her hands bound. She pulled a small burner phone from her pocket. It buzzed once. A text message appeared on the screen. It was short and contained no names, just a list of news links. She clicked the first one. The headline read, "Major logistics firm raided, CEO taken into custody." There was a grainy photo of Arthur being led out of the warehouse in handcuffs. He looked small and broken, his expensive suit rumpled, his face pale under the harsh police floodlights. The article mentioned that an anonymous tip had provided unprecedented access to encrypted files and voice recordings that tied the firm to a decade of international smuggling. The second link was a local police report. It noted that 4 men had been found at the scene with minor injuries consistent with a physical domestic dispute, though none of them were talking. Vance and his crew were going to prison for a long time, and the best part was that they were too terrified to explain who had actually put them there. To admit they were defeated by one woman, the same woman they thought they had killed, would be a death sentence in the world they lived in. She closed the phone, removed the battery, and dropped both pieces into a recycling bin. That life was closed now. A soft footstep sounded behind her on the wooden planks of the pier. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She knew the gait and the rhythm of the person approaching. It was the man from the black sedan. "The cleanup is nearly done," he said, standing a few feet away. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at a seagull bobbing on the water. "The feds are thrilled. They've been trying to crack that warehouse for years. They think they got lucky with a disgruntled employee." "Is that what I am now?" she asked with a slight smile. "A disgruntled employee. On paper, you don't exist at all," the man replied. "Which is exactly how you like it. But the higher-ups are asking questions. They saw the footage from the bridge's traffic camera before we wiped it. They saw the fall, and they saw you climb back up." The woman leaned against the railing, feeling the rough wood under her palms. It wasn't a big deal. The height was manageable, and the pylons had good grip. The man let out a short, huffed laugh. "Manageable. Most people would have hit that water and stopped breathing from the shock alone. You used it as a shortcut. There's a rumor going around the office that you've forgotten how to use stairs and ropes entirely." "Ropes are just things that can break or get tangled," she said quietly. "If you rely on them, you're only as strong as the cord. If you rely on them, you're only as strong as the cord. If you rely on yourself, you're as strong as your training." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, plain envelope. He set it on the railing between them. "Your new identification. A passport, a driver's license, and a clean history. There's also a ticket to a small island in the Pacific. It's quiet. The water is warm, and nobody there knows what a logistic firm is." She looked at the envelope but didn't pick it up yet. "And what's the catch? There's always a next job. No catch, the man said, finally looking at her. His eyes were kind but tired. You've done enough. You were supposed to be watching a box, and instead you took down a criminal empire while being thrown off a bridge. Consider this a long overdue vacation. The agency owes you more than a plane ticket, but this is a start. He turned to leave, but stopped after a few steps. One more thing. Why didn't you just take them out on the bridge? You could have ended it right there before they ever pushed you. The woman looked back at the Blackwood Bridge in the distance. Its silhouette was tall and imposing against the morning sky. I needed to know if I still had it, she admitted. The training, the focus, the lack of fear. When you're in the field for so long, you wonder if you've become dependent on the gear and the team. I wanted to see what happened when it was just me and the water. And? The man asked. The water is still the same, she said. It doesn't care who you are. It doesn't care about your medals or your rank. It just reacts to how you move. As long as you don't fight it, it carries you. The man nodded, satisfied with the answer, and walked away. His car engine started in the distance, and then there was only the sound of the waves. The woman picked up the envelope. She pulled out the passport and flipped to the first page. The name was different, but the face in the photo was hers, calm, steady, and remarkably peaceful. She tucked it into her jacket and began to walk toward the parking lot. She passed a young couple who were setting up fishing gear at the end of the pier. The young man was struggling with a complicated knot in his nylon rope, huffing with frustration as it tangled around his fingers. Need a hand with that? His partner asked. I just can't get it to hold, he complained. If the rope doesn't work, we can't fish. The woman paused as she walked past them. She didn't stop, but she spoke loud enough for them to hear. Maybe you don't need the rope. Sometimes you just have to get closer to the edge. The couple looked up, confused, but she was already gone. She reached her motorcycle and swung the leg over the seat. As she kicked the engine to life, she felt the weight of the night finally lifting. The secret about being a Navy SEAL or anyone trained to survive the impossible wasn't about being stronger or faster than everyone else. It was about understanding that the edge isn't a place where things end. It's just a place where the rules change. She twisted the throttle and the bike roared, carving a path through the morning fog. She had a plane to catch, a warm ocean to find, and for the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder. She had faced the drop, she had mastered the fall, and she had come out the other side. Behind her, the city was waking up, unaware that its safety had been bought by a woman who had been thrown away and refused to stay down. The bridge stood tall, a monument to a night that officially never happened. And deep in the river below, the only thing left of the struggle was a single, discarded cigarette butt, drifting slowly out to sea.